I'm Joan Lingard and I'm a writer, a novelist. I write novels for children and adults. I started to write when I was 11 years old and living in Belfast as a child. I lived in Belfast from age 2 to 18, and because of that, quite a lot of stories about Belfast have come into my writing. I began to write because I was so keen on books. I read and read and read, and I read everything that was in my... I read so quickly that I could bring home 2 or 3 books and finish them by the end of the day. And one day when I was moaning in my mother's ear I had nothing to read, and she turned and said to me, "Why don't you go and write a book of your own?" And I thought, well, why not? Why shouldn't I write a book of my own? Why shouldn't you, if you want to? So I got lined foolscap paper, filled my fountain pen with green ink, and I began to write. I wrote a book about a girl called Gail who went to stay with her grandmother in Cornwall, and it was about smugglers and things like that. I was probably reading Enid Blyton at the time. I'd never been in Cornwall. But I thought, Belfast, dull, deadly Belfast, what interesting thing could happen here? But something interesting can happen anywhere. You can write a story about any street, any place. And I learned that as I grew and wrote more. When I came to publish my first book, it was situated firmly in Belfast, and it was the 12th day of July, about Protestant Sadie and Catholic Kevin, who come together during the Troubles that haunted Belfast. In the end, I wrote 5 books about them. The quintet about Kevin and Sadie are popular really from Norway right to New Zealand. I've spoken in both places about them. In 2010, the 12th day of July will have been in print for 40 years. I have done quite a lot of talks during the 40 years all over the place in Europe and Australia, New Zealand, Canada. Also out of my Belfast childhood came The File on Fraulein Berg. This is set in 1944, towards the end of the Second World War, and it features 3 girls who think that their German teacher is a spy. They're suspicious of anything German because the south of Ireland was not in the war alongside Britain. And in Dublin you could see the swastika on a laundry running about. And it was always said that spies came in over the border. So when a real-life German appears in their school, they decide she must be a spy and that they are going to track her down and create a file on her. Now, I'm going to confess that I was one of 3 girls who did think her German teacher was a spy, and we followed her around Belfast, making her life pretty miserable. And some years later, perhaps as an apology, I wrote the book, The File on Fraulein Berg. My ideas come to me in many different ways. They come from things in my own childhood, or perhaps my husband's. He was a Latvian refugee who had to flee from his country when he was 8 years old, when the Russian army was invading Latvia. And I wrote a book called Tug of War out of that. And then I started to get interested even in my grandparents' lives, because they ran a pub in Stoke Newington in London in the early part of the 20th century. And they had 11 children. And my grandmother was really quite a character, so was my grandfather. I started to think about them, and somehow or other then along came the idea, instead of having 11 ordinary children, to have 11 orphans. So I created Ma and Pa Bigsby, who have a pub called the Pig and Whistle, and they take in orphans from the streets of London, because London at that time was quite different from now, of course, with gaslit, horse-drawn coaches, and a lot of orphans led a pretty miserable life. And so I brought Elfie to life, and her best friend Jo, whose parents were Jamaican originally. And that became the 11th orphan. And when I'd finished the 11th orphan, I found I was so interested in the lives of Elfie and Jo that I wanted to carry on with them and find what would happen to them next. That's the great thing about being a writer, you want to know what happens next. And so I've written a sequel called Jo's Story, and it's set in 1901. And Jo is now 14, ready to go out into the wider world, and Elfie is 12. I like variety when I'm writing. I don't want to write about the same things all the time. And that's why I've moved from one country to another and one period of time to another. I've got The Orphan, which the 11th Orphan, it's set in 1900, The Fallon Berg, 1944, Tug of War, also during the Second World War, and then there's Holly, who's set today, contemporary. Holly is 11 years old and she lives in Glasgow with her mum. Her mum's a bit feckless, and she takes her to Queen Street Station to put her on the train to Edinburgh, where she's going to meet her dad. And she's looking for a nice lady to park Holly with, who will keep an eye on Holly for the 45-minute journey. And when they get into the station, she's looking around and she can't see anybody suitable. And then Holly suddenly recognises someone familiar. And her mum says, "Who's that you're looking at?" And she says, "Oh, she's a writer. Her name's Nina Nightingale, and she came to our school today to give us a talk." As writers sometimes do, I have to say, they do go to schools to give talks. So her mum makes a beeline for her and goes up to the writer, taps her on the arm, and she asks her, would she be good enough to keep an eye on Holly until she gets to Edinburgh, where her dad will be waiting for her. Her dad works in the oil in the Middle East. So Holly, very unhappily and very embarrassed, has to get on the train with this writer. And when they arrive in Edinburgh, well, I wonder if you can guess what happens, because you see, when you write a story, not everything can run smoothly, otherwise there's no story. Her dad doesn't turn up. So Nina is left with the problem, what to do about Holly, which is the title of the book. So I wonder who you think that writer could be based on. You see, ideas come in all sorts of ways. Things happen to you, and you just take the kind of nugget of what happens and you develop it, and you say to yourself, what if? And of course, you might be thinking that with Holly, maybe her dad doesn't turn up. That is a possibility, isn't it? I don't ever sit thinking, what will I write next? Ideas come into my head from different times and places. They can be Belfast. And Edinburgh, of course, comes into it with Holly, because when I was 18, I came back to Edinburgh, where I was born, and this is where I live. And a part of what to do about Holly is also set up in the Cairngorms in the north of Scotland, because we happen to have a house up in that area too. So I use bits and pieces of my life, places I've lived. I need to have some association with the place and the time for it to become real for me.